Hello, Internet, and welcome to another episode of Discussions with David. I'm live streaming from here in my living room in Portland, Oregon, every weekday at 10 a.m. Pacific, noon Central, 1 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. GMT. On Mondays, the broadcast is an open mic that I host, and everyone anywhere with an internet connection and a song or a poem or something they can do in front of a microphone is welcome to participate. People can sign up for the next Pandemic Open Mic Monday by going to davidrovics.com/POMM. On Tuesdays, I interview folks under the auspices of producer Peter Werby for Fifth Estate Live, a project of Fifth Estate Magazine. Wednesdays through Fridays, I host my own self-produced interview show, which has so far mainly involved catching up with old friends in a public setting, usually people I would be hanging out with in person at some point during a given year, especially around this time of year, if I were touring and playing music like in the pre-pandemic times. All of these broadcasts go out on the Facebook pages of Popular Resistance, KBOO Community Radio, and various other platforms, including my Facebook page and my channels on YouTube, Periscope, Twitch, VK, and LinkedIn. When I first started lining up guests to interview for this live stream series, I scheduled this discussion with today's guest, Dr. Larry Mosqueda. I first met Larry around the time I was taking a course at Evergreen State College in the early 1990s with one of his colleagues who I interviewed recently, Pete Bomer. Since that time, I have seen him at many different events in Olympia, Washington, where Larry has been a fixture in social movement circles there for decades, teaching political science and history at Evergreen State College. Larry's name has also come up in unexpected circumstances, such as when my mother met him one summer in Hanoi. As the pandemic was taking hold in the United States and the government was attempting to respond to the situation, the economy was going into a tailspin, wildcat strikes and rent strikes were spreading across the country, and many other developments were developing. I kept on being reminded of one historical anecdote after another, and I kept wondering if Larry was having the same experience. So now I get to ask him in person. Larry Mosqueda, welcome to my live stream show.
Oh, thank you. Glad to be here.
I just wonder, first of all, if as you know, in the early days of the Trump administration, I was personally being regularly reminded of Germany 1933, and it may have been that I had recently reread a book on the subject, but there's so many historical parallels, and maybe just too many to even get at the beginning of them. But I wonder if this has been a regular feature of your life for the past year or two or three, just constantly seeing these parallels to the Depression, to the Second World War, the First World War, the pandemic of 1918. I don't know if.
Yeah, exactly. I think, I think actually there's a lot of parallels between nothing actually ever happens exactly the same, but there are lessons that we can learn from history. Otherwise, we shouldn't even be bothering to study history. And so we are actually starting maybe a Great Depression right now, but certainly bigger than the Great Recession of 2008. And so which is connected to the pandemic, of course. That's why the economy was shut down, which is connected to the 1918, historically speaking, to the Great Flu of 1918. And so it's connected also to racism that we're seeing in the last 2 weeks. Racism is going on in this country, since 1492, since the country in 1776, but since the Europeans colonized started in 1492. And especially since the 1600s, when the Europeans, especially the British, started to come here and installed slavery in 1619, now 401 years ago. So all these things are connected and coming together. And so we need to learn these lessons from history. Otherwise, we're in very serious trouble if we don't learn some lessons and do something about it fairly quickly.
One of the things that I've just noticed, just actually this morning, looking at the headlines, is that there's been protesters have been targeting statues of Columbus in addition to Confederate statues, and that to me seems like a wonderful step in the right direction, because trying to make institutional racism out to be a problem of the Confederacy only is a major mistake in terms of understanding this country.
Yeah, like today, I just read on the Common Dreams that the statue of Columbus in St. Paul, Minnesota, was taken down by the American Indian movement, which is perfect symmetry of what's going on. And Columbus actually, as you know, never even landed in North America, let alone the United States. And Columbus himself, actually, when we have Columbus Day on October 12th, we don't actually celebrate Columbus. We celebrate the myth of Columbus. That Columbus basically was not a very important historical figure in 1592. I remember in 1592, there were no celebrations of Columbus, either in the so-called New World or Europe. 1692, there were no recorded celebrations of Columbus in the New World or in Europe. 1792, there's a little bit of celebration in what we now call the New United States, because it actually justifies the Europeans actually having control over the West. And the big one was 1892, where the Columbus Exposition in St. Louis or Chicago, where actually we're celebrating the end of the Indian Wars, the conquest of the West. And in 1982, of course, there was a big sort of brouhaha, which I helped in Olympia too, to sort of try to take back the myth of Columbus. So Columbus is going down historically. And one of the reasons we know that Columbus was not particularly important during his lifetime is we don't even know exactly where he's buried. That some people claim he's buried in Spain, some people claim he's buried in the Dominican Republic, and they both claim him so they can make it a little tourist attraction.
And it's really, it seems, I mean, this question of how we understand history and how important or unimportant or good or bad a figure like Columbus is, it really is it's hard to overstate how important that is, isn't it? To understand how they frame these things. What is this narrative? Whose land is this? Who does it belong to? Yeah.
And Attorney General Barr just said, I think it was 2 weeks ago, that history is written by the victors. And he had a little smirk on his face too.
Yeah, when I'm one of them.
I'm one of the victors. And they won't.
Now he's not so sure, it seems.
Yeah, and it's going to be, the history will still be written. I mean, people who are my age, I'm a senior citizen, sort of have seen this thing coming along, but things are going to be considerably, I think, different for my grandchildren, who are now, of course, young children. And they will, hopefully, will be able to live in a freer world that, as long as people like us, and I'm older than you too, people like us, get to keep on doing what we need to do.
Do you actually feel? Are you feeling hopeful and optimistic about this moment? I'm sensing a shade of hope and optimism there. I'm kind of like, I'm not getting that from a lot of people, but then again, things are changing over the past few days.
Well, I'm a real fan of Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci, in which he talks about pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. And so I'm a college teacher, retired college teacher. So presumably in a classroom, you want to be as intellectual as possible. And that's why many sort of intellectual arguments are quite pessimistic. But if you want to go out in the streets, you need to be optimistic that actually something might change. And something actually might change. But we're in a turning point right now, not just in race relationships, but also in climate change, which are very, very important. Plus, actually, with people like Trump in charge of the country right now, it's a very, very dangerous situation. I mean, one of the things that you keep hearing, I think you probably heard it too, that people talk about, well, we're going to come out of this pandemic. We're all in this together, and it's going to be over someday. But we're not all in it together the same way. If you're a person of color, you're more likely to die and get sick. If you're a poor person, you're more likely to be hurt by the Great Recession and the Depression. And if you're a black person or a person of color, you're more likely to be attacked by the police. So we're sort of all in it together, but we're not all in together the same way. And it's like saying, for example, in the Great Depression, well, it'll eventually end. Let's say we're talking in 1930, a year after the Depression starts. Well, yeah, it's going to eventually end, but it ends in 1941, so 10 years later. And in racism, well, after 250 years of slavery, that ends, but it ends in Civil War. And then we have Jim Crow until 1954. And so it eventually ends, but something else comes. So things do get a little better, but it depends on where you are in history, where you are, and we are an important part of history right now. Important point.
That part is very clear, isn't it? And also the fact that whereas it may be true, as far as I know, that left-wing intellectuals basically always fail to make accurate predictions in terms of what is going to be the spark that sets off the powder keg. But it's easy enough to observe the powder keg. Like, I mean, anybody could, anybody could have said, yeah, we're sitting on a powder keg here. exactly what's going to set it off and what form it's going to take is unknown. But how would you? I mean, looking around you in Olympia, but also on trying to figure out what's going on in terms of all your contacts in the media and whatever else. How would you describe the uprising that's taking place? Because I mean, the corporate media is trying to frame it in various ways and with various emphases on their own fabricated idea of what's the difference between so-called violence and so-called non-violence, and then also they're creating this whole narrative about the more sort of trying to, it seems to me, kind of limit the scope of the uprising to certain issues that are, while extremely important, it seems also to be a bigger, more intersectional uprising than the way it's often being painted.
No, I think it really is, because if you take a look at because I've been to a couple of small protests around Olympia, and there's a few more that's going to happen, and other things are going to occur. But basically, if you take a look at who's involved in the protest, it's not it's a black-led protest, but it's not blacks primarily. In fact, since most of the people in the United States tend to be European, I don't like to use the term white because that's actually an invented term also. But you're Europeans, is that in Seattle and in Chicago and even in Washington, D.C., you have a real interracial uprising going on. And, enough is enough. And plus, I was very surprised, I think in the last couple of days, I saw that something only like 31% of the white population actually is against the protests. That most people are supporting the protests. They're against, for example, broken windows and a couple of little things of violence, but it's not really that violent because not that many people are being hurt. Like, I don't consider vandalism to be violence. I consider vandalism to be vandalism. It's not good, but it's not necessarily a revolutionary act in and of themselves. But there's
this
a lot
is how
of
the media is framing. The media is always framing that as violence. And another thing they're always doing, which is especially disturbing, is framing it at, like, whenever there's so-called clashes between protesters and the police, it's generally coming in the context of people taking to the streets and marching in the streets, which is sort of construed without being explained directly. The media seems to construe that as being something that invites a violent response, which then means that Martin Luther King and Gandhi were constantly inviting violent responses, apparently.
Yeah, and of course they weren't. They condemned them. But look, that's, again, going back to history. One of the things we learn in, say, the second grade is that we celebrate the Boston Tea Party, which is actually destruction of private property owned by the legitimate, quote, legal authorities from Great Britain. But we celebrate that as an event. We celebrate now, for example, the Civil War, at least those of us who are not particularly racist. So don't celebrate the war, but we celebrate the victory of the end of slavery. But that only happened because of extreme violence. And also John Brown even becomes a historical figure that many of us talk about. Now, hopefully we don't have to sort of go to those extremes, but there are possibilities. And I'm not advocating them per se, but I'm not saying that they can't occur. Because as an academic and also as an activist, I have two different levels here. One is to analyze what's going on, and another is actually to help participate. And one of the things that sometimes in my career, some teachers have said, well, you shouldn't politicize your activities. But actually, if you take a look at schools, colleges, law, all the good law professors actually practice law in court, not just in the classroom. All the good medical doctors practice in university and university hospitals. All of the art teachers actually make art. Now, all of the film teachers actually produce films. And so if you're involved in sort of the social sciences, whether you're a college teacher, a regular teacher, high school teacher, or whatever, you should be involved in history. And take a look at your children. If you're not involved in history, then you're condemning them to do the same thing that's happening. That's going on right now, and historically speaking. Plus, Martin Luther King, as you know, was actually reviled by the establishment back in the 1960s. In fact, he was murdered by various people. When you take a look at the family's website, they actually point out that it's very likely that the government had some hand in that killing. And so, but now we have a holiday. In fact, we only have two holidays that are named after people in the United States, which just shows our split personality. We have Columbus Day and we have Martin Luther King Day. All the other holidays are actually sort of generic holidays. Christmas is actually supposed to be about the birth of Christ, but it becomes a commercial activity too.
That seems very symbolic, huh?
Yeah. So
the two holidays.
The two holidays. And so hopefully the Columbus Day holiday will morph in. It's already morphing into many places, including Seattle, into Native American Day. because actually the October 11th was the last day that Native Americans were free of foreign influence. When people talk about the borders, I always say, well, we lost control of our borders about 500 years ago.
Yeah.
And so certain people shouldn't be coming over.
One of the things that I've been thinking about in terms of historical parallels and in terms of recent months was when the multi-trillion-dollar bailout program began, and thinking about how in the Great Depression, beginning with the stock market crash in 1929, it took 3 years, I believe, before government policy sort of rose to the occasion in any kind of way, a serious way, in terms of trying to deal with hunger and poverty. And there had, I believe, I remember reading in Zinn's People's History that in 1931 there were 500 different incidences of large numbers of people with guns liberating the contents of warehouses across the country. And this was one of the many types of incidences that were going on that inspired the government to actually start dealing with the situation in some way other than repression. But this time around, despite who's in power now, the response was much quicker. I wonder what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, because in the Great Depression, it started October 1929. So the Hoover administration just started literally that particular year. Now, for example, this current recession, Great Recession, perhaps Great Depression #2, actually started in the last year of the Trump administration. Plus, we have learned a lot, economically speaking, over the last 100 years on how to sort of deal with these issues. And what the government did currently is basically to print money. You can print money, not just actually physically print paper money, but digitally just create money and give it to people. Because 70% of the economy of the United States is based on consumer demand, consumer aggregate demand. And so if people are not buying things, then the economy is just going to collapse. I mean, there have been many people, going back to presidential candidate Yang and also to even Bernie Sanders and other people, talking about we should just be giving people money right now, like literally $1,000 or $2,000 a month for a whole year. Everybody, including Bill Gates. And then at the end, you actually tax people who make over, say, $100,000 a year, so you get the money back. And so we could actually be giving people money, and aggregate demand would be better. And so there are things that can be done in the current situation that would make things better. But every single thing, literally, that's when Trump came into power, I knew it was going to be bad, but I didn't know he was actually going to do every single thing wrong. It's
right?
Like it's like he has a conscious effort to destroy America. In fact, because I have a radical analysis that I've given in classrooms, and sometimes students ask me if I really don't like the United States. I said, no, if I really didn't like the United States, I would support everything that Trump is doing, because it's bringing it down. It's bringing it down. So people who are supporting Trump are actually not un-American, but they're really sort of objectively speaking anti-American in how the American people should be operating. So we could actually get the economy going again, but not by laissez-faire economics. I mean, that was actually an issue that was settled literally in the 1930s and 1940s, especially in the 1940s, and after World War II. The economy boomed in World War II, and the elites decided in 1947, actually back in the Bretton Woods Agreement, but starting up in 1947, to really prop up the economy, a welfare economy. And we should, instead of having a warfare economy, we should have more of a welfare economy in regard to just giving people money and resources such as healthcare and also free college education. Like, for example, free education is actually a money maker. Like, for example, the average state school costs about, now costs about $12,000, $15,000 a year for in-state tuition, which is about $50,000 for a 4-year education. But the average college graduate makes approximately $1 million more in their lifetime than does the non-college graduate. So if you give somebody a college education, they have to be qualified, of course, to get in. But if you give somebody a college education, they will pay over the lifetime more in taxes than they actually cost them to go to college. And people will be better off. But of course, that would change the dynamics of class society. Instead of having like literally a few hundred billionaires in the country, you would have no billionaires. I mean, if you can't get by on say $800 million, then I think you got a problem. We could put a limit on how much wealth you can have, like they do in Sweden and places like that in Norway. And I would say $500 million, That's enough.
That seems like enough. Seems
That
like
seems
more
like
than
enough.
enough.
I mean, if Bill Gates and Bezos and those people can't get by on $500 million, they got a significant problem. Yeah, but everybody would be better off.
Yeah, that's for sure. I saw a bumper sticker once that said houses. Everybody gets one before anybody gets two, which is maybe we could be even more flexible with that. Everybody gets one before anybody gets six of them or something. But yeah, 500 million, that would seem.
Yeah. In fact, one of the things about the Great Depression is that I always point out people with the Great Depression is that 1928 the economy was booming, the Roaring '20s and things like that. And it looked like the economy was doing great, like it was a year ago in this country. But in 1930, there was just as much concrete, just as much labor, just as much labor power that existed, just as much timber that existed. But yet we're in a Great Depression. So it's not a question that there aren't resources. It's a question of how you allocate the resources. And right now, there should be no homeless people in the United States. Should be none whatsoever. And we're not talking just a moral issue. We're talking about
an economic and a health issue, but they did come up with this multi-trillion-dollar bailout. So they were at least they're not doing a universal basic income or anything, but at this point, but this bailout was they did that, and that's that was to me surprising that the capitalists were even capable of that level of sort of forward thinking that they could do that. Were you surprised, or did you expect that they'd be that they'd?
Yes and no, because they did come up with a $2 trillion bailout, but most of that money actually went to the major corporations and major businesses. Plus, there's another $4 trillion was actually available to them through the loan markets for subsidized loans. So it's actually more like a $6 trillion bailout of sort of different monies and loans, et cetera. And most of that money went to large corporations.
So that's not surprising. That part is very normal. Yeah.
Which is actually not going to solve the problem, because this the so-called CARE Act actually the extra money for unemployment, $600 a week extra for people who are unemployment insurance, that ends in the end of July. So actually, we haven't even seen. In fact, a lot of people are not getting their unemployment because there's snafus and sort of
me.
Yeah, you.
I applied at the beginning of April, and I just got rejected. Actually, even though I'm a classic within the definition of a gig economy worker who had my whole tour canceled. Multiple tours canceled.
Yeah, but you can sort of appeal, and presumably most of the people are going to get some, maybe in a big chunk later. A big chunk being like $10,000, which is not a lot of money. But basically, it's going to collapse more in August and September, and so it's going to be even worse than it is right now. So people who have enough resources should be stocking up for that.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. And what do you think in terms of there's also suspensions on evictions and that are going to be expiring and have already expired in many states and will be expiring in other states. And there's, I imagine, if unless there's going to be more bailout activity that's actually targeted towards the working class, then we're going to be seeing massive waves of evictions and all sorts of other economic calamities in the near future.
Yeah, plus it's actually a lot of, like we started off talking about how things are interconnected. The pandemic, which we did not have in 1930, we had a pandemic in 1918, but we did not have a pandemic with the Great Depression, at least a major pandemic. So that's going to get worse too because of the so-called opening up by Trump administration, and plus the attitudes of people right now who are in the streets, plus people who are supporting them, which is the majority of people in the United States support the protests. All the polls have indicated that. Not every single thing, but they support the protests. So you got the attitudes of people are changing. You got the pandemic occurring. People are going to get sicker in September and October. And also the economy is even going to be in worse shape. Like today, the stock market went down as of right now, about 12 or 1,300 points. It goes up, it goes down. And so, for example, I'm retired and I sort of watch it as sort of from a personal standpoint, as it's a little bit of a source of amusement, because it's, in one sense, it's if it goes down a lot, then I'll lose a lot, but I won't actually start losing until I'm in my 80s, which is another 10 years or so. But it's probably going to be okay, unless it totally collapses, which is possible. And so, but for most people, it's already totally collapsed. In fact, for about 41% of the population, they really have nothing. And that,
In
like you said,
terms of the money they had invested in the stock market, like in
no,
terms of people with investment funds, or I mean, with
I'm
like
talking about
retirement
40%.
accounts, or
I'm talking about 40% of people who aren't invested at all,
who are
and
okay,
and
right?
have lost
I
their
see.
jobs. Have
Yeah,
lost their jobs. Is that they may be getting evicted. I mean, there are laws saying that they're not supposed to evict them, but then who enforces the laws? And so it's one of the things about evictions. Actually, it's not the landlord who comes and throws your stuff out on the
it's
street.
the
It's the
police,
police.
right? And
It's the police.
that's another thing I've been wondering about, because I mean, to me it seems pretty obvious that like there's so many millions of people facing potential eviction, either who have either lost their job or about to lose their job, and of course the police are being are sort of the target of protests because they're the front lines of representing institutional racism and oppression in this country, but they also are the front lines representing maintaining property laws and capitalism, and they're the ones that come and evict people when it's time to evict them. It's the armed enforcers of the law that enforce the law.
Yeah, I think the police had a lot of sense around the country, which is debatable, especially in the big cities. They should make a public pronouncement that they're not going to evict anybody evict anybody from their private home in 2020. They're just not going to do it. And that way, the people on the streets would say, well, maybe the police are working people on our side. Well, they are, and they aren't. They're armed agents of the state, but they would make people actually more amenable to the police. And then, because the laws are, you're not supposed to evict people right now, and so anybody being evicted is actually being evicted illegally. But if you're a poor person, what are you going to do? Unless you're going to resist, and then you might get, if you're African American, you actually might be killed by the police, because they do it under the dark of night to do this type of thing. So people need to, I think, have mutual aid societies locally, and people need to. One of the things I see about the current protests is that a lot of it is very unfocused. I mean, it's focused against racism, and leaderless movements actually sound good, but I think there actually needs to be leadership developing out of these particular areas, whether it's New York, Seattle, or any small town too. People should be organizing themselves of what they're going to do, because if it's in September or October and they don't have any food, then what are they going to do? And so it's like you talked earlier about sort of people actually stealing food, so-called stealing food in the 1930s. But even in the 1930s, we had more capacity. We as a society had more capacity to deal with a little bit of poverty, not a lot. I mean, a lot of poverty, because it was only 1920 when the majority of Americans actually became urban. And now, of course, in 2020, 100 years later, over 80% of the population lives in an urban environment. So one thing that people should think about is how much food they actually have available for themselves in their home. I have about 30 days worth of food and water and things like that. And that was because I was getting ready for an earthquake in Seattle, which is a possibility.
And and everybody in the Northwest, if they're sensible, apparently, I mean, I'm not including myself in that group, but we should all be prepared for a major earthquake, because it is coming.
Yeah. And so like the people in Michigan had a pandemic, layoffs, Great Depression, and then they got flooded out of their homes. I mean, the world doesn't stop because major things are occurring, pandemics and Great Depressions and other type of things. But people need to be organized, not just sort of think that the government's going to come and help them. Because that's one thing I learned from Katrina in New Orleans, is that if something minor happens, like minor in the sense that you've got a fire in your house, there is going to be a fire truck to come to help you. But if there's a major flood or a major earthquake, nobody's coming. They're not coming for at least a week, if you're lucky, to come and help you. So people should be prepared for that type of thing. But also people should be organized and not afraid to go into the streets.
Yeah. And what are you seeing in terms of mutual aid projects there in Olympia or Seattle or that area? There's quite a bit going on.
Well, there's some. I mean, people are talking about it, and people are sort of, I think the people with poverty, people who have been in poverty before, are actually getting together around their church. I'm not a churchgoer, but people getting ready around their churches, and people actually developing more food banks, etc. So these are sort of things that people should think about consciously, and not just think about it sort of, well, we should do it sometime in the future. Because I'm a big believer, like in the homeless issue, that we just don't focus on the immediate, but also in the long term. Like I often talk to people about homeless issue. If you're a homeless advocate, there's at least 3 different levels. One is that a lot of people need a place to sleep tonight at 6 o'clock, and you need to help them, or somebody needs to help them. And then people need to have a home that they can go to, like in 6 months, or 6 weeks, have an apartment, have a home, something type of thing. And then in 6 years, you don't want to have actually, there should not be homeless advocates in 6 years because there should not be homeless people. So those are the kind of things you want to plan for. But don't just plan way too far in the future, but also think about things immediately. But don't just think about things immediately, because then you're going to be working as a homeless advocate 6 years or 16 years in the future.
And in terms of the homeless question, I mean, it seems to me that I'm involved with this rent strike going on here in Portland, and I've long been interested in the subject for whatever reason, in terms of who owns this country and property ownership and renters and all that. But it all seems to be coming to a head in so many different ways now, with property priced so outrageously high and rents so outrageously high in so much of the country, and now suddenly people who were already extremely rent burdened, and this here, Portland is the most rent burdened city in the country, but people were already extremely rent burdened before, and the pandemic hit and the economy collapsed. But now it's a whole different level, and you see the evidence all over the place in terms of people not repairing their broken cars, not repairing their broken teeth. I mean, just the state of society is decaying by the day. It seems like when you walk around. But the inability of the U.S. to ever deal with the basic questions of widespread poverty and homelessness, it's a contrast with many other industrialized countries which have more or less effectively dealt with extreme poverty. Like, you don't find extreme poverty in Scandinavia or even in Germany to speak of.
Yeah, because there are plenty of resources. I mean, before the pandemic, the top 3 people in the country, which would be 3 richest people, Bezos, with the guy from Nebraska, Buffett, and who owns Gates? Not Gates, was it? Who owns them? Yeah, Microsoft. Is basically they own more wealth than half the population of the United States. The inequality. So all these big issues that existed before are being exacerbated right now. And so the people who are really poor, which is actually about almost a third of the population, and I say really poor, is that they're on the verge of being either homeless, or on the verge of not having enough food, on the verge of not having their children be able to go to school, and still have 20 million people still have no health care in this country, even with so-called Obamacare. And so the economy is actually starting to fall apart. Now, one of the things that could happen is that we could actually decide to, like in Scandinavian countries, decide, even within the capitalist economy, decide to make things better by making things better economically, by making things better, say, like Franklin Roosevelt did in 1930s. And Franklin Roosevelt was no socialist. He was very much of a capitalist, and actually when he ran for president the first time, he actually criticized Hoover for spending too much money.
Wow.
But when he got in, he saw that the conditions were so bad that he actually started to do some things. Like right now in this country, like in Seattle, for example, in West Seattle, the bridge is actually closed down because it's literally falling down. It's going to collapse. And many bridges in Seattle are that way. And Seattle is a rich city. And so about half the bridges in the country are actually on the verge of collapse, according to the American government, according to how they rate things. And also, so we could actually have an infrastructure program, which people could work, and then you'd actually have jobs coming out of that. And at the end of 5-10 years, you actually have roads and bridges. And that's actually without even changing the overall transportation structure. But then also you could be like, I lived in Japan for 4 months and also traveled in other places. And we have the worst railroad system of the advanced industrial world. And so you really can't just go on a train. On the East Coast, you can get on some old trains, but you really can't just go on a train and go from Seattle to Los Angeles like on just a regular basis. And so we could build a train system that would cost $1 trillion. For example, it's $2 trillion. They just passed. They just printed the money. We could build it, for example, over the next 10 years. And one of the things that, because I've been on different webinars with different people, and one of the points that was made, which is very, I think, important, is that the government can no longer claim that there's no money. If they can decide,
they've demonstrated very amply here that there is money and they can just fabricate it and spend it. Yeah.
Yeah, they can basically, if you can come up with $6 trillion in a week.
That kind of precedent, like, I mean, they also, I don't know if it's actually been done, but it's been talked about in the way that has been made very clear that it's perfectly feasible that many governments, even without state or federal help, that municipal governments have the wherewithal because of so many wealthy people with so much who own so much property and the taxation and everything else, that they can house all the homeless people in, all the municipal governments in places like Seattle, Santa Cruz, San Francisco, Portland could themselves house all the homeless people in those cities. But the precedent that would set and what that would do to the real estate market, and if there wasn't the threat of homelessness, I mean, that's I wonder how big a thing that is.
Well, it is, because there are plenty of vacant. Look, I read in San Francisco, for example, that there are more vacant homes and rooms than there are actually homeless people in San Francisco and Oakland. So if we want to end homelessness, it's very simple. Give them a home. It's not that complicated. I remember when I was in college about 40 years ago, one of my teachers said, one of the ways to get rid of poverty, you just give people money. So just give people money. You give people enough money where they can live on, and they will spend the money. If you have nothing and you're getting paid, say, $25,000 a year or $2,000 a month, you will spend that money. You're not going to invest it. You will spend the money, and that keeps the aggregate economy going. And then eventually people will get out of poverty. Plus, in this country, we have a very poor healthcare system. In fact, we have the worst healthcare system of the Western industrial world. And so, because and the most expensive, more than twice as much as anybody else. So it's not a question of can we afford universal healthcare. It's a question of we can't afford not to do it. Every other country in Europe, in fact, when I was teaching about this stuff in schools, I asked the question, how many people lived in a town where there was no public school system in the United States? And nobody raised their hand, because I said, well, that's a stupid question. Of course there's public schools. You can talk about the quality all you want, but there's public schools in every single location in the United States. That was not true 150 years ago. It took a lot of political organizing to get public school systems established. And so the same question with the medical care is, how many people actually have, in the last 3 or 4 years, they've had a time when they or their family did not have access to medical care. And about half the people raised their hand. Because that's a stupid question in Europe, is that we should actually just do it. And it's actually cheaper, it's better, and people live longer. I think right now the United States ranks about 40th in life expectancy. Mm-hmm. And actually in the last 3 years, life expectancy has been going down in the United States. That's a serious indicator of a country in decline. Because it's not just a recent pandemic. We're talking about the last 3 years. Life expectancy has gone down, especially for white males, because there's a lot of different activities, for example, drugs, etc. So that's actually, and the drugs laws actually are, now marijuana has become legalized in most of the country in various ways. But actually the drug laws were specifically aimed, and President Nixon talked about this, is actually aimed to actually get at the Black population. Yep. Which is why we have a lot of blacks who are in jail right now. In fact, this is actually a statistic which is mind-boggling, because I remember giving a talk about Black Lives Matter literally 5 years ago. It was about 5 years ago in Olympia, when a couple of black men were shot. And I looked up the incarceration rates around the world. The United States has more black people of African descent in jail, in prison in the United States, than the entire continent of Africa has in prison. So we have more African Americans, which is only about 40 million people to begin with, a total population in prison in the United States. The entire continent of Africa has people in prison.
And also, I think in comparison with apartheid South Africa, we
were worse.
We're worse. Yeah.
It was 6 times the rate of people being put in prison. So it's quite mind-boggling. But it isn't, because going back to history. I mean, the police originally started in very good books. I don't know if you read The New Jim Crow by Alexander. It's an excellent book. And also a book by Taylor called From Black Liberation to Black Lives, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, in which they talk about basically the police as an institution started off as slave patrols. That's what the police do. They capture black people, historically speaking, for the last 300 years. And they're still doing that. And that's what they're doing. And even the cops who
but
are,
organized police forces and standing armies have a lot to do historically with suppressing the labor movement as well.
Right.
This is being to hear this being talked about by mainstream politicians of both parties who I can't imagine a Republican politician even uttering the word slave patrol, let alone admitting that the police forces originate from slave patrols. But it's really quite a historical moment we're in now that they can actually talk about these things.
Yeah, and in fact, I wrote a very short paper on the Second Amendment about a few months back. I wrote a review of Roxanne Dunbar's book on the Second Amendment, in which talk about, the Second Amendment. People quote the Second Amendment, right to bear arms. That's not the Second Amendment. The entire Second Amendment, if I remember correctly, is that how exactly does it start? There are three components to it. But basically, the right to bear arms is the last one, but being necessary. I forget the exact wording, but basically is that to form militias that you have a right to bear arms. But that, actually in the South, that was to enforce white men to have guns, so they could be forced to be in the slave patrol when slaves ran away, to arrest black people and to bring them back. In fact, in Virginia, I remember reading this in Howard Zinn's book also. In Virginia, 1 year before the Civil War, 1/3 of the budget of the state budget was to pay white owners of slaves who were executed for running away, because the owners were losing money because their slaves were worth money. And so rather than compensate the families of African American people, they were compensating the slave owners for losing an African American slave. So the entire history of the United States, going back to Columbus and coming back to Trump, coming to Trump, is actually sort of skewed. And that's why people like Trump are announcing today that they're not going to rename the Confederate named army bases, even though the Confederate army was basically traitors to the United States. I mean, do you think about sort of taking armed struggle against the United States? If they're traitors. If they would have won, they would have not been traitors. They would have been the liberators. As Barr says, history is one but written by the victors.
Yeah, as Barr
says.
Yeah,
the Second Amendment, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right to bear arms should not be infringed. So the security of a free state, actually, that particular phrase was the slave states.
Yeah, the way they use the term freedom to mean a country that owns a large amount of its population.
And that was a quite conscious activity.
Yeah. This distortion of this revolution, which was a pro-slavery rebellion. Yeah. Larry, in the recent piece you wrote, you talk about possible ways to get rid of Trump on the assumption that there may or may not be an election in November, and that if there is an election, it may or may not be recognized by the Trump administration as valid. Mm-hmm. And that's a very interesting set of assumptions to work with. And then you write a piece about how it might conceivably be possible to get rid of him before we face that eventuality. And I wonder if you can just expand on that a bit.
Yeah, well, in the last couple of months, especially with the pandemic, which is total failure in the Trump administration, and not right now, 112,000 people, Americans, are dead officially. It's more than that, 112,000. Is that people have been writing, like people like Ralph Nader, Mark Green, other individuals have been writing that Trump needs to resign for the good of the country. Except Trump doesn't care about the good of the country. Trump only cares about Trump. But also, it's a very dangerous period right now, because we have 5 months to the election. This is the beginning of June. The election's in November, in the early first week of November. And then, of course, there's 78 days between the election and also the inauguration. So every night on the news, I hear that this is 1,000 some days since the Trump presidency. We have about 150 days now till the next election. And the assumption by many people is that if Trump loses, he's just going to go. That's what presidents have done since Washington, literally since George Washington. Except Trump has indicated that he might not go. He's joked about it a couple of times, and then he's actually seriously talked about it a few times. And there are other people indicating that he might not go either. And there have been disputed elections in the past. 1876, which is at the end of Reconstruction, which is why Reconstruction ended. there was an election where Samuel Tilden and Rutherford B. Hayes, and Tilden won the presidency, both in the popular vote, and was one vote short of the Electoral College. But the deal was made to end Reconstruction and give the South back to the slaveholding oligarchy, but not as slaves, but to have control over black population. And that was in 1877. And as you know, we're now into the 21st century. There have been 3 presidents since year 2000, and 2 of them have lost the popular vote. So we don't even pretend to live in a democracy anymore. We have this Electoral College, which is a vestige of slaveholders. In fact, they actually thought about this when they were actually doing this. In fact, we all know about the 3/5 rule, and sometimes people think the 3/5 rule that there was an insult to black people, which it was, but they were slaves at the time, so it's hard to insult a slave because they're totally subjugated anyway. But actually, the North wanted to have black people counted as 0 persons, as a 0 person.
Because it really was just giving the southern plantation aristocracy more power, right? Because with 3/5 of the vote, then that means they got more of the vote, because it's not like the slaves were voting.
Yeah, they got a whole person. So it's very warped mentality, because the South recognized that black people are in fact people. So they want them to count as people, but they won't let them vote, or they'll count them, but they won't let them participate in any type of liberty. So
it reminds me a little bit of the how when corporations value their property for being taxed, and then they value it entirely differently when they're trying to sell it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So anyway, in 2000, the Gore Bush campaign, it was virtually a tied election, and actually Gore won the popular vote. Actually, it came out a year later when they actually did count all the votes, and so he would have won the Electoral College vote. But that was about 2 months after 9/11. And the press didn't. They mentioned it, but they didn't. Nobody really talked about it from the elites, because they didn't want to. After 9/11, we didn't want to, as a system, say we don't want to quote get the legitimacy of the president in doubt. Mm-hmm. So it is possible that there will be an election this year in November, and Trump and his Republican Party doing everything they can to disenfranchise voters. And the most recent example of that is in Georgia, a couple of days ago, when there were long lines, etc. And so it's possible there'll be an election, and it'll be very corrupt from the Republican side. The Democrats aren't exactly a virtue, but it's, they want to have an election. And it could be possible that it could be very close. And in places like Florida, Michigan, and Wisconsin, I write about this in my paper. Actually, especially in Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, I believe the governors are Democrats and the legislatures are Republican. And the way the Constitution is written, that the legislature will send the Electoral College votes to vote, which is on December 5th. Actually, December 14th. There's actually a real place where they go to. They go to the state capitals. Now, that's the election that counts, not the popular vote, but the election that counts, the Electoral College. So it is possible that if Trump is very close and lost the Electoral College, that he won't let them meet. He could send troops, because there could be, quote, riots in East Lansing or riots in Pennsylvania, and then which he might actually start, and then say, okay, we're going to militarize the area. Because if the Electoral College voters can't meet, then they can't vote. And then it becomes the question, who's going to send the Electoral College to the votes to Congress? And the legislatures actually which are controlled by Republicans in various states, could say, okay, no, we're going to do it. And then the Democratic governors could say, no, you lost the election, and we're going to send it. So there could be actually 2 sets of Electoral College votes actually sent to the Congress, and then the Congress has to decide who's going to become the president. And so it is quite possible that Trump could lose the election popular vote. In fact, I think he will, and also even lose the election Electoral College votes, which I think he might, and then still become the president of the United States. And then if people accept that, then basically the Constitution becomes a suicide pact. Because I mentioned in my article, one of the reasons that we need to get rid of Trump is because he's a very, very dangerous person, which as we've seen, for example, in the last 3 years. So one of the ways we can get rid of him before the election is to get him to resign, which people have been talking about. And we can get him to resign because we can say, okay, you're going to lose his family or other people who got him to stop doing the COVID-19 press conferences, which were getting ridiculous. Is to say, okay, I'm going to resign because I'm being treated unfairly. Sad. I'm going to resign because I want to spend more time with my family. You know, I miss Barron and all that kind of stuff. You know, the usual type of stuff. And then he can say, "But I would have won, but I'm not going to take it anymore." But before he does that, he can pardon everybody in his family and pardon his buddies. You know, give a presidential pardon, and then he can resign within an hour. And then President Pence can pardon Trump, because Trump is afraid of going to prison. He's not likely to, but Mueller actually said in both the report and also in the testimony that the president can be charged with crimes after he leaves office. So he can be charged, just like Nixon was pardoned. The president could have been charged. Nixon could have been charged with crimes, but Ford gave him a pardon. Mm-hmm. But the reason that some people may not like it because, well, they say, well, I hate Trump, I think he should go to prison. Well, maybe that's true, but no president has ever gone to prison. Yeah. Not Warren Harding, Teapot Dome scandal, not Nixon, not Andrew Johnson for his impeachable offenses 100 years ago.
And the Teapot Dome scandal, can you just remind us what that was? Because I hadn't heard of it until I read it in your article, and I looked that up, and that was really quite something.
Yeah, it's basically sort of like leasing oils and other type of, basic criminal activity, not actually unconstitutional stuff, what is, but
large scale criminal activity.
Yeah, the type of stuff that Trump does, and the type of stuff that Spiro Agnew did. He was the vice president of Richard Nixon. When he was the governor of Maryland, Agnew was actually getting kickbacks and actually envelopes of cash. I mean, basic, corruption, basic mafia type of stuff. And then Spiro Agnew was forced to resign when under Richard Nixon, and that's how Ford became president. And so you have all these presidents who have done all these different things, and they don't go to jail. And so the idea that Trump's going to go to jail is unlikely. So it's actually possible to get Trump to resign, and he can keep what he has. If he doesn't really commit any more crimes, except after he does that, then he'll be okay. And the state, because people say, well, he'll face state charges. Yeah, same thing with Spiro Agnew. That's part of the plea bargain, is they just drop all the charges. That's what the American government does with mafia-type figures all the time. And Trump is a mafia-type figure. We give them their freedom and go, just go away. Just go away. Because one of the points I make, and this is very important in my paper, is that if Trump actually has an election, he loses the election on November, and he's going to go away, he's still the president for 78 days. And he can actually start a war. He almost started a war with Iran. Remember when he assassinated one of the government officials? He was talking about starting a war with North Korea. And now he's actually getting sort of huffy with China. And one of the problems with fighting with China is that you should never, if you're an imperialist country, don't fight wars with countries that can fight back.
Yeah, right. It's usually not done.
Usually not done. But that might be his parting gift, his middle finger to America for actually voting against him. And I wouldn't put it past him at all. I mean, the fact that he can actually today get up to 112,000 dead Americans because of his bad policies on COVID-19, and then he calls it a great success, is actually he's a very demented person. And I quote in a couple of sources in the paper that many people call him a malignant narcissist. And so I put in a footnote: is he a malignant narcissist? Is he a regular narcissist? Is he just a sociopath? One thing he is not is a stable genius.
And not a stable genius. And I think you say Pence presidency, Pence would be a president with the integrity of Richard Nixon and the intelligence of George W. Bush, but that would be an improvement over the current situation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And Larry, you have been an election observer in El Salvador on multiple occasions, I believe. And I wonder just if you have any passing observations on differences or similarities between the elections here and there.
Yeah, well, one thing is actually El Salvador, Bukele, I think his name is, as a new president, is actually a right winger. And one of the things that happened is that, which is a problem with Trump, is if Trump goes away, that does not mean that Trump's supporters go away. And so how did we get to the situation where Trump has the support of approximately 40% of the population, pretty hardcore support? He's not going to go below 35%, no matter what, no matter what he does. And so a third of America, a little bit more than a third of America, is on the verge of fascism. They become like the shock troops for fascism.
Do you think a civil war is a prospect? People in Europe have been asking about a possible civil war in the United States. And if there were one, I wonder what the battle lines would look like.
Yeah, me too. Because actually, it's one of the reasons I was talking earlier about we need to become more organized. One of the things I looked at when I was talking about getting ready for your show was just because there's a massive rebellion, which is what's going on right now in the streets. It's not a riot, it's not a revolution, but it's more like rebellions that are going on. It doesn't mean that it's going to turn out well, even if Trump leaves. And the Arab Spring, which I followed, and you probably followed it too, and it was occurring in Egypt and other places, in Tunisia, did not turn out well for many places. They got, like in Egypt, for example, they got rid of Mubarak, and then there was a Muslim Brotherhood official who was elected, and then now they have a dictatorship in the military.
Well, they had to contend with the U.S. Empire and other foreign influences. Yeah, of course.
And in Syria, it still does not turn out well. And so I think people need to sort of consciously think about what they want, get organized with other people, and not just think that things are going to turn out well. And that's why my ending comment in my paper was that if we get rid of Trump, we can celebrate for about 24 hours.
Yeah, right.
And take a break for 24 hours and then get back to the work, because we can't really depend on Biden or Pence or whoever's going to be president next year to make things better. I don't support Biden, but because I live in Washington State, so the Democrats are going to win. It's not even a question about, well, I might throw away the election. No, in Washington State, in Oregon, in California, the Democrats are going to win. In Mississippi and Alabama, the Republicans are going to win. So I know those. There's only about 12 states actually are like, if I lived in Iowa or Michigan, I might be thinking, well, should I actually do this or not do this? But I don't live there. I can sort of think about other things. So we need to actually organize other individuals, both in the streets and the schools and in our workplaces too. One of the problems right now is that with the COVID-19, it's hard to actually have a workplace organizing because you're not there except by Zoom, and which is actually not the best way to organize, but it's not impossible. So we need to think of more innovative ways to do things. And I don't have
what kind of structure do you think? I mean, when you look at the history of good organizing, what kind of structures for organizing stand out?
Well, for example, you're quite versed on the labor movement. And one of the things, for example, in the early part of the late 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, workplace organizing was very not easy to do, but actually you were there with people. And so those are the kind of things that people should get ready to take over, because it's get ready to take over actually the workplace, because the workers are the people who actually quote do the work. And also in schools should be places of rebellion right now. Colleges and even high school should be places of rebellion and also thinking about the future, because the future of our young people is actually to try to organize themselves for themselves and their children to become, have a better world. And also in the streets, we should do stuff in the streets, but also the street action should reflect analysis and not just sort of having a good time sometimes.
Like so strategy. Like, I mean, one thing I'm wondering about is like there's a lot of history of street actions that actually take space and hold on to it, like Tahrir Square or Occupy Wall Street or so many others from around the world. But what have you heard anything about this police station in Seattle that's currently been occupied? I don't know.
There's a group of people forming what they call an autonomous zone, which is, I remember we did that kind of stuff back in 1969, 1970 too. But with the idea that you're probably not going to hold it forever. So you need to sort of organize. If you're in an autonomous zone right now, that's the place to be organizing. That's the place to be talking about what you're going to do. The WTO in Seattle in 1999, I remember going to one of the convergence buildings where people were actually organizing before the WTO. So they weren't just sort of running around the streets. They were actually talking about these issues.
And months of serious organizing. Yeah. I mean, people moved to Seattle from all over the country to work on that protest.
Right.
For months before.
Full time. And so the current stuff going on right now is obviously when people say it'll be over. Well, it will be over, but hopefully it's not going to be over this year. The pandemic is not going away.
No.
The Great Depression, number 2, is not going away. Not this year. In fact, the head of the Fed said we might be years into this. And racism, unfortunately, is not going to go away. But we can actually organize multicultural, multiracial, I prefer that term, multiracial groups, which is actually forming right now. So we should be thinking about this, I always try to think in terms of like 5 and 10 years in advance. If you're actually, what kind of society do you want to have in 10 years? Okay, so then what are you going to do this year to actually get that goal in 10 years from now? Then what are you going to do this month to get that goal at the end of this year to move that? So, because if you think they're going to have a revolution in June of 2020 and things are going to be good in September of 2020, you're living in a
you're definitely living in a fantasy world.
Yeah, but you can actually make things better and make yourself more powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Larry Mosqueda, thank you so much for joining me. This has been a jam-packed hour of discussion, and we got to get you on to talk a lot more because we only just got started. But
yeah, thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah,
okay.
We'll be in touch, and we'll see you soon.
Okay,
I hope.
I'll see you later then.
Yeah, great. Take care.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And thanks everybody so much for tuning in to this discussion with Dr. Larry Mosqueda. Tomorrow I'll be talking with longtime organizer, artist, and author who was also very much involved with organizing the protests that Larry just mentioned in Seattle, David Solnit. You can find all of these discussions archived on my YouTube channel at youtube.com/drovics in the Discussions with David playlist. You'll also find them all in podcast form if you search for This Week with David Rovics on any podcasting platform, or via the David Rovics mobile app, or on my website at davidrovics.com. I have a new album out on Bandcamp, which you can stream for free, called Notes from a Failed State. The music, the live stream broadcasts, and the podcasts are all free. But if you want to support my journalistic and musical efforts, plus have access to some exclusive offerings just for patrons, please join my community-supported art program, or CSA, at davidrovics.com/subscribe or patreon.com/davidrovics. Artists for Rent Control is now set up to start organizing an emergency eviction response team. Please go to artistsforrentcontrol.org and sign up. Hope to see you again soon here in the Matrix and out on the streets. Don't pay the rent and don't be afraid of your neighbors. Mutual aid will get us through. Bye for now.